Hi, Khara. Good to see you.
Good to see
Um,
you.
I'm here with Kara Crossway Brindle, gives the gift of interviewing a lot of therapists and sharing a lot of information and resourcing through your, I think you would call it like counseling development efforts. Uh,
Mhm.
and you also teach at the University of Denver. And I think what I've heard is you weave these things in where
Mhm.
you're that
I
professor
try.
that'll say, and by the way, it's a business. You're that professor that says, you know, um, you need to really think about the population you want to serve, while you're here in grad school. And then you lead a group practice, which I think if you're a therapist looking for a place to practice in the Denver area, that's one of the top. Um,
Oh, thank you,
I
Jim.
Yeah, well, I know you resource and have process and things to support each other in their growth, and that you exemplify to me in psychology. Right, they've been talking in the last 20 years about a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, and how a growth mindset and a belief that you're not just put in a circumstance, you also can grow, you can stretch, you can develop talents, is kind of would be like, it would be to me like our growth Crossway Brindle. That would be like your superpower is encouraging people to grow.
Thank
So
you.
we talked a little ways back about therapist use of self. You interviewed me, and when we were getting done, it was thought about what are like 5 tips or questions or core questions that are like powerful questions that you would suggest for therapists that are like maybe newer on the journey or feeling stuck on the journey of therapy, being a therapist, or wanting to deepen their work or go in a new direction.
Mhm.
Do you have thoughts about that? Like, what if somebody like called you up and said, "I'd like to, I'm struggling, or I'm looking for direction, or want encouragement."
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that's two parts, which I know we talked about offline. If we think about the green clinicians first, the immediate first question when you pose this interview to me is asking what they want in a supervisor, because it's such an important relationship at the beginning of our career to have someone who's mentoring, who's leading, who's supporting, who believes in us. Um, I've been reflecting a lot recently about having a horrible supervision experience in grad school and then having a really wonderful experience in my first job, and recognizing that
Mm,
that really helped me stay in the field. If I'd had horrible upon horrible experiences, I might have burned out sooner or quit the field because of that leadership. So I think that's an immediate question that pops in my head is, what do you look for in a supervisor? And have people sit in that and recognize this is what I need, not just I need someone to sign off on hours for licensure, which is important. Like, what do I need in the relational aspect? What support do I need from them to really grow?
right, and to recognize if you're at that point of maybe you're looking for agency work, that can you ask a few people at the agency before you accept a job or apply?
Right.
How's the supervision and support? And if you hear bad things, take that into account. And I realize
Yes.
sometimes you just have to take the job. We have to
Right.
feed ourselves, our families. Um, and if what would you suggest if you're somebody experiencing bad supervision or new? I think of sometimes supervision just seems like not helpful. It may not be harmful. It just kind of. What would you suggest within that relationship, or how to know when to move on, find another supervisor?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people, it's even just recognizing the different styles of supervisors, of like what kind of framework do they use. We coined the empowerment model, and how that shows up as like very fluid roles that the supervisor holds to support the supervisee. But maybe they're looking for a reflective model or a psychoanalytic model or something like that. And so I think even just giving someone a crash course on here are some of the things to know about supervision, because they don't know what they don't know. Then they come into that experience and they're like, is this good or bad or neutral experience with a supervisor? To your point, if they're in an agency, they might not have a lot of autonomy to say, I need a different supervisor. Maybe they could advocate with the director for that, but I'm sure the pool is limited because agency work has kind of a revolving door and people don't stay for
Mm,
very long.
right.
Um, But then we get down to like the finances of pursuing a private supervisor. Now, a lot of people expect quality supervision at, like a steak quality of supervision at a hot dog price.
Right.
And that's not going to work out. So I think, having these kinds of interviews helps people start to think about what is most important. Do I need to budget for a supervisor outside of where I'm working? Do I need additional supervision? Like, what are my options there? And just recognizing it's about fit, just like a client and therapist relationship.
And maybe take the risk of advocating for yourself, to be able to say there's aspects of this mentoring relationship that are really helpful to me. And there's parts of me that seem invisible to you, or you tend to always want to go to this direction with me, but I'm actually struggling with something over here. Can we try to
Right.
experiment with that and talk about that? And sometimes, you know, a supervisor in an agency can say, Kate actually does really good use of self work. Why don't we set up a couple meetings with Kate, and
Mm-hmm.
resource you? But if you don't speak up, they don't know.
Yeah, I think that's
And
really
and we
important that you named that of like, if you can't just say I'm quitting my supervisor if you haven't even brought it to their attention, something needs to shift. You always need to talk
if
to them first.
if you were to take the empowerment model, what's the core essence of it? The core value or key? How would I know I'm in an empowerment supervision relationship? What would it seem like, feel like, you
I
know?
love that question. It really feels like the supervisor is adapting to your needs. So when you're saying, let's say a supervisor is advocating, I really want to focus on this thing today. I want to focus on transference and countertransference. I want to staff this case. But the supervisor doesn't have their own agenda beyond making sure that they're providing quality and, staffing caseloads and things they're required to do. But for someone to feel like they're truly in an empowerment model supervision style, usually they feel like they're heard, they're seen, they're respected, they're not treated as less than. There's not this power dynamic where it's like, you do what I say kind of thing. It really comes from a place of like curiosity and compassion of, I'm going to support you. You're allowed to make mistakes. And that was something that was
Nice.
modeled to me with my supervisor. And I really I needed that. I craved that at the time. And I want that for everyone.
Yeah, passing that forward, creating that. So supervision question, maybe another question or advice you'd have for,
Yeah. Well, I think I'm thinking of my students right now where it's like they don't really know who they want to work with. And so sometimes the question is, who do you not want to work with? And it's a
oh,
red flag
good
when
one.
people say, I want to work
Good
with
one.
everyone. Because yes, we could work with lots of different people, but maybe we're most effective with a certain population. Maybe we are most neutral with certain populations, but find that we have a bias towards other populations. So when I'm interviewing a potential supervisee or I'm talking to my students, I ask this question of, tell me at least one population that you don't want to work with. And if they can't name
Mm,
one, that's a conversation of like, you need to discover this about yourself because you aren't the fit for everyone. But can they be transparent? Can they be honest? If like, what, I really feel like I would have a hard time working with XYZ population. And I think that's
right.
important self-awareness to have going into the field.
Well said. Before I applied to grad school, I was trying to, beef up my resume because I got my bachelor's at 22 and I'm seeking to go back to grad school at 26. And I did some things like kids in divorce and separation group work. I liked it. And one was I was doing 12-hour shifts at a halfway house for chronic schizophrenia. And it was so sad. And a lot of it was, can I get another pack of cigarettes? And I realized I had a lot of compassion, but I just didn't, I just like, I don't think I'm the person to do chronic,
Mm-hmm.
intense, acute. So I kind of knew, like I told us early on in supervision, I can deal with these relational crises with families at Denver Children's Home, but I don't think I could be the ER like a psychiatric nurse.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
It's
just
a
not knowing
difference.
that, that that's just not, I do, there is a challenge though, isn't there? That some of the, when we like, I wouldn't want to work with this population, that you're talking about more of a gut sense that it's just not a good fit for me
Mm-hmm.
versus I've set up my own self limitation and I don't want to stretch, or a
Mm-hmm.
bias that we really ought to challenge. We
Yeah.
really ought to look at and say, but wait, that's going to show up in your office, and you need to understand where's that bias coming from, and how could
Mhm.
you open yourself up. But what great questions. Do you have a third one? You're on a roll.
I think the third one, especially when I think of like clinicians new to the field, is to start paying attention to what kind of trainings get them excited. Because again, I think we
Mm,
come into the field with like, I have to be a trauma specialist, I have to work with anxiety and depression, and yes, all those things come in your door. So to your point earlier of like, if you say I don't want to work with trauma, that's just not going to happen, or I don't want to work with suicide, that's not going to happen. Like that's going to show up in your office. To your point, but getting them to start noticing what am I wanting to pursue, and then like having like kind of a goal towards that versus a I'm going to just like hemorrhage all my money into trainings and then kind of do a jack of all trades. Like maybe there's one thing they want to move towards and start to specialize in because they're passionate about it or excited about it. And I wish someone had encouraged me to think that way when I
mm.
was first in the field, because I think that would have changed the trajectory of my work a little bit more, to be like, pick one area and really put some time and energy into this first, and then start to expand as you need to. I don't know. Does that
That's
make sense to you, Jim?
that's brilliant advice. No, I think it makes absolute sense. And some of therapists listening may be generalist, right? That they, but then that maybe what they're honing in on is what are maybe my core values or key moves I make as a generalist. That it's more of a stance I have as a therapist. But I think that's right. That well, you and I talked about that in a previous uh, talk. Of I learned from a person I worked with at Denver Children's Home, Larry, who said once a year I there's so much ambivalence here in the staff of working with these tough situations and tough, teenagers that are struggling and often like oppositional, and working with their families and limited resources in the agency. And he just felt so tired after 2 years, so that once a year he just have a talk with himself and say, am I going to do one more year? If I am, I'm going to go all in. And next year, he happened to do it at the NCAA March Madness. He'd take a week off and have this.
Uh-huh.
So I adopted that, and then pruning. Maybe as we segue from new therapists to all of us on the journey,
Mm-hmm.
um, I found value in what's still giving me energy, what feels like an old yes that's turned into a no.
Mm-hmm.
um, and maybe that's what you're talking, that kind of overlaps with that. Start paying attention to what model, what kind of training, what clientele or modality gives you the most jazz, because your energy matters, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a precursor to burnout, right? Of like paying attention to
Mm,
what still gets us excited versus we're like, meh, we're just going through the motions because we're still human
mm,
too. And so for those
mm,
seasoned clinicians that are listening to us, like you and I have, I think in our own ways, champion pivoting of like, okay, I'm rooting out the things that don't feel relevant anymore, or I've aged into this population, which is pretty common of like, a lot of us don't want to work with, for example, children that are our children's age, if we have children, because it feels like it's hard to have separation. So like maybe I'm not working with teenagers for a while because I have a teenager, or I'm not working with, young kids because I have a young kid. But I actually took a pause on doing EMDR, which I know is very much respected and exciting. A lot of people are doing that, but I recognized that I wasn't as excited about it back in 2021. Took a pause and have moved into financial therapy as one of my pivots, which was because I
mm.
got really excited and invigorated talking to someone who did it. So for anyone watching this, pay attention to like, that energy in your body of like, oh, I could see myself doing this. I'm
Oh,
excited, or I want to talk to someone about it versus the ho hum of I'm going through the motions, which might be
yeah, not
burnout.
feeling it. That's brilliant. That's like kind of like playing a hot and cold game in your work, right? That EMDR was hot and energetic and for you, and and then something's happening that maybe if we're doing like a exploration of your use of self, like, maybe too many trauma stories a week for me or something. And I
Mm-hmm.
could do it with each individual, but, you know, 17 a week or something. I figured out early on in my career, as an example, when I first started doing private practice, if I had a certain number of depressed clients, it started to stir up the depression I went through as a sophomore in college.
Mm-hmm.
And I just was like, yeah. And I think that was part of going back and pushing for more family therapy and couples therapy. Because in my agency work, I was doing a lot of relational work, and there's stuff happening in the room. And I started like, I like the challenge of how do you create safety and structure without, you know, taking away people's autonomy and volition, and that energized me. So I'm paying attention, and I go like, eventually, yeah, I rarely see individuals. I do intensives with individuals, um, but I knew like, yeah, too much of something isn't good for me. So
Right.
you're honoring. I think what you're talking about too is honoring our own process and listening to what our heart, our mind, and our bodies are telling us. Right.
Exactly.
Do you have
And
a
not
fourth
feeling
question?
guilt.
These are so good. Maybe we can get to like four or
Well,
five.
I think I have five in my head. So number four would be how do you want to network? And this I think applies
Mm,
to seasoned and green clinicians because a lot of us identify as introverts or ambiverts. You like those terms. And so to network feels like a growth edge of like, I don't know if I want to go mingle with people, or I didn't realize I could do this online or one on one, like we do videos together. Could be a different way than the traditional networking that shows up in people's heads. If I'm in a room full of 20 people and I have to go say hi or feel like it's like speed
mm.
dating or something. Um, so for green clinicians, I think this is important to build that support network that we all need. And for seasoned clinicians, this helps with like ongoing consultation or even just the human to human connection of like, hey, private practice can feel kind of lonely sometimes when it's just me, or I'm the group
Mm.
practice owner and I have to have this leadership role. And so having close colleagues that you can lean on, confide in, ugly cry with if you want to, like whatever it is that you feel like there's no judgment. I think that's really important and is the purpose of networking for some folks.
Yeah, I like that. That's elegant. We did that. That there's networking that's about creating a network of support that we as humans live in nested groups and networks, and we can be, in multiple networks,
Mm-hmm.
versus networking, which is most often like marketing,
Yeah,
promoting,
which makes us
handing
all feel
out
like this.
cars. Yeah. 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 Wow. You have a fifth one, you said.
Final one I think would be more about the self-care strategy and right. So like my experience so far is people get into about year seven of this career and then start to burn out if they haven't created a self-care strategy that works for them. So whether that's taking a week off at March Madness, like your colleague, or I'm going to work, 6 weeks on, 1 week off, or I'm going to not work Fridays or whatever that is. I think
Hmm.
this really falls under that
Hmm.
workaholism burnout combination that I track with a lot of clinicians of like, is this working? You have your ideal schedule. What is the ideal schedule and how do we get there? Because to say I see 40 clients a week should not be anything that we all champion. And yet it still shows up in these Facebook groups of like, oh, I saw 40 clients this week. And I was like, why? Why would we want to if financially there's another way to do this and for your own
Yeah, I
self
can
care?
respect it if, yeah, you're at a program in a mental health center, your Kaiser caseload or mental health load is you need to have 32 billable hours.
Mm,
Um, and boy, that's a lot of stories and hearts and
right.
relationships to bounce around in 1 week. I think that's why I gravitated towards intensives because I might have two in a week. But it's one relationship for Monday, Tuesday with two people, and then one, and I breathe and come back. But that bouncing around, I think to know your empathy, what's
Mm,
your empathy overload? When I was doing hourly sessions, I saw it around 25, 26 hours. That 27th hour at the end of the week, I don't have the empathy. I don't have it. I'm
you're
starting
not
to
your
phone it
best.
in.
Yeah.
So maybe I just need to cap it. And
Mm,
my first supervisor at grad school, Sharon Olson, told me a year or so in, develop an anti-burnout plan. And
yeah.
I found later, I read this book, a good friend of mine, Greg, had The Power of Full Engagement. And it
Mm,
really organized, I think, a really interesting way to avoid burnout is to be more fully engaged in what you're doing. And I think sometimes as therapists, instead of going towards like the pain a couple is feeling and going in it, we're trying to protect ourselves from what's happening around us. And that takes a lot of effort. We know from the research on like avoidance attachment strategies, it takes a lot of energy to avoid your own experience, your own deep emotions. Um, and that's what I see you do. You're like fully engaged. And you've done something. Here's one to answer your, way for self-care. I'm going to reflect back to you. I think you're doing something powerful. You're teaching,
mhm.
you're mentoring, you're developed a business, a group practice that you're leading and creating opportunities, and you're seeing clients
Right.
for, oh, there's gonna be five things like your questions. That was not planned, folks. This is spontaneous. I swear. And then you have your counseling development where you're giving back. And I think, doesn't that make it not, you can be fully engaged in a teacher, but if you were a full-time, you know, and you had to do research and get grants, that'd be one thing. If all you did was lead your group practice as a business person,
Right.
maybe wouldn't be as, if you just saw clients at 30 hours a week that a lot of people need to make money, especially if you take insurance, right? Insurance still does not keep up with inflation.
Right.
Um, if you just did counseling development, or if you just did like these interviews and podcasts and stuff, right? These things, but you're doing a wonderful, like, you swim around and like you said, you're fluid
Mhm.
and you pivot.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that reflection. I think a lot of people right now are just like, what are you doing now? And it feels like a judgment, versus the
Mm,
curiosity of like, what are you up to now? And it's interesting that you and I are having this conversation today because earlier this week I had a conversation about like this Jungian archetypes and, this guide part showed up for me. Like I'm guiding people and how these things are all interconnected, but someone on the outside who doesn't know me very well might not see that it's connected to serving mental health professionals in all these arenas, whether it's suicide prevention, Medicaid, counselor development, teaching as a professor, having a group practice. Like they're all interlinked with this mission to serve mental health folks. So I
man,
appreciate that
you're
doubling down today. I'm like, okay, I
just
hear it.
thank you for bringing up Carl Jung and Jungian and archetypes. Such a
Yeah.
powerful model that's right. You're channeling a guiding, resourcing archetype,
Mm-hmm.
and look at that, it ties it all together. And maybe that'd be the meta answer to all those questions of yours is keep trying to rediscover, remember, and remind yourself there's something about being a therapist that ought to be part of a deeper life journey.
I love that.
How did your
Mm-hmm.
family or culture or community or context call you to this work? How does this work impact you at the heart level? Let's find supervision and mentoring that's supporting in that journey, and will
Mm-hmm.
challenge you as needed. Like Sharon that I mentioned challenged me a lot, made me
Yeah.
really um, what 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 population or modality calls to you and makes your spirit and heart and mind just go, wow. And it's all, each of your questions could point us back to the deeper journey,
Right.
right?
Something
And
that's
I hear
connected
in
to
you that fluidity.
values.
Yeah, the other thing about your fluidity is, I imagine, if your heart and mind and spirit saw a need that wasn't being met and felt like you could help resource and meet that need through bringing these, you're going to say yes to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then,
Somebody just brought
yeah,
one of those to me this morning. Like, hey, this is what I think needs to happen. And I said yes. So
there you
future
go.
videos coming. But yeah, it's the pain points. That's how I describe it from entrepreneurship is if I see a pain point that's not being addressed or could be addressed further, the creative spirit in me likes that challenge and I'm going to go towards that. And I think everyone has that ability in them if they listen at that deeper level, like you said, of like pay attention to what really gets you excited about something. Because it's not just, oh, I should do it because everyone else is doing it. It's because I want to do it. And I think that's
Well, well
radical
said.
to green clinicians who are just said, this is how you have to go into private practice, and this is how you do the thing. And there's so many ways to do it. So possibilities.
I can also see reframing your questions, even if somebody's been in the field 20, 30 years and are, wanting to refresh or redirect or hone their work. What kind of mentor, colleague support do you need at this time in your career?
Mm-hmm.
What what's been calling to you and what used to call to you and isn't calling to you? And you could just
Love
go
that.
through those questions, those five questions maybe on a like once a year, kind of like the financial advisor, the financial therapist, what's your relationship to money?
Mm-hmm.
What's your relationship to your own career?
Right. I love that. And I know you mentioned that offline and I asked you to talk about it here of like just that check-in. What does that check-in process look like? That's always okay to ask ourselves, are we feeling fulfilled? Do we have purpose? Do we need to shift something, adjust something, or pivot? And I think, I can't remember the term right now, but this idea of when you invest in something, it's really hard to change because you feel like I've been
Mm,
in it so long. It's a financial term and it's escaping my mind right now, but something bias, like investment bias or something. But when we make this commitment, it's hard to give ourselves permission to pivot. And I think you and I are saying, go for it. Why not try something? See if it makes a difference. Like we will champion the pivots.
that's beautiful. That sometimes, as we go, pivoting often means quitting something
Mm-hmm.
and letting something go, something that we were really invested in. His colleague Joe Monahan, that Jerry Aker and I, that I opened my first private practice office with, and we worked together at Denver Children's Home, dear friend. And Joe died way too young, and
Mm-hmm.
but Joe used to say about Denver Children's Home to people, this place will live within you, but live without you when you leave. And sometimes we just get invested in what we're doing, and our heart and our soul and our body are saying, Khara, let's stop with EMDR for a while. We can come back to it. It won't go away. And then
Right.
that creates opening for financial therapy. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So hopefully our
Well,
viewers are feeling inspired by this.
yeah, thank you. How about to listen to this at different points in my career, to have those questions would be so helpful. And I know you're impacting more people than you realize, and I love the the quality and the diversity and the engagement of people that you're often interviewing. I think one in
Thank
particular,
you.
like Liliana Balin, like
Yeah.
so I know her more. Um, but you also seem to find folks that are really people that are really authentically engaged in this work and are willing to talk about it in vulnerable, transparent ways that I think are inspiring. If you're at an agency or a practice or something, everybody's kind of doing that, oh, hero, and trudging, and you want to be inspired. Um, these are the kind of questions to ask, and go find some people that a community, a group that will
Hmm.
fuel your inspiration rather than say you're naive, or you're
Yeah.
misguided.
Or it's always been this way. So just stay in your lane.
Yeah. Well, thanks.
Exactly.
Yeah, you switch lanes, you switch highways. You decide the highway isn't good, you're going to try a helicopter. That's how I see
Right.
you.
Be in the water, whatever. Yeah.
Hey, let's go swimming. Well, thank you, Kara.
So many
Thanks for the
ways.
time and those five
Yeah.
questions.
Thank you,
And if
Jim. I
people want to
appreciate
get
it.
hold of you, what's the easiest way to find you?
Probably through our website, crossfitcounselingllc.com. It's where all of my projects are housed. That's where the team is housed, all the books, the things that I do. So happy to have people
Awesome.
visit there and see how I can help them.